Let's start now with MS Now senior national security reporter David Rohde, White House reporter Jake Traylor, political analyst and former Obama Undersecretary of State Rick Stengel, and New York Times investigative reporter Adam Entis. David, the president of Colombia is now weighing in on that land strike that we saw or may have seen in Venezuela. What do we know?
Essentially, he's criticizing it, and he sees this as a threat, I think, to his own country, in part because President Trump has also criticized President Petro of Colombia. He is more to the left on the Colombian political spectrum. He's been criticized by the Trump administration for not eradicating crops as much, for drugs as much as possible. But there's no links between President Petro and narcotics trafficking as you have with President Maduro in Venezuela. He's not actively facilitating drug transit in any way, shape, or form. So it's a very different situation. And last of all, President Petro won the most recent election in Colombia. There'll be elections in the spring in Colombia. So he's a sovereign leader. It's a very different position from President Maduro, who lost the last elections in Venezuela and has stayed in power. So it's a very different situation. It's a risk for President Petro. Many leaders are afraid to criticize President Trump publicly, but I think Petro has decided it helps him to push back in terms of domestic politics. So we'll see how Trump reacts to Petro's criticism.
A bit of a sense of the international implications all of this may have. Jake, there's concern this could lead to a larger ground operation. What is the talk behind the scenes at the White House about the end goal here, and is there consensus?
Yeah, Ariel, there seems to be a bit of consensus behind the scenes, but what there's not is clarity in the messaging of what is really ultimately behind this. I was just speaking with a White House official who, when I asked them, where is the end goal here? Where does this end? And is it ultimately regime change in Venezuela? They said, it's not just regime change. It's about stopping trafficking of drugs, which, again, they've not provided evidence for. It's that Venezuela would stop harboring terror. But whenever I pressed a bit more to that official and said, well, by your metric, wouldn't the quickest thing and the best thing to do then be to have regime change? That official said, well, yes, of course. So there seems to be this read between the lines messaging that's ongoing with White House officials behind the scenes. And also publicly, we're seeing that from the president when he keeps saying it's not about regime change, but it is often Maduro's name who is on his mouth when he is talking about change in Venezuela.
So, Rick, for now, Maduro is publicly seeming to laugh off the threat from the U.S., but what kind of retaliatory measures could he end up taking?
Well, he's doing his best to actually show the people of Venezuela that he's not worried about it, that it's not a threat. I think it's clear, as we've been saying, that what the U.S. interest in here is regime change. The problem is, as the White House correspondent said, they don't have a plan B. They don't have it. What happens after Maduro resigns or is overthrown or there's a military coup? And so one of the things he has going for him is the fact that the U.S. doesn't actually have a plan and hasn't, said, we want leader X or leader Y to replace you. So he's the only game in town right now. How
significant is it that we see the crew of this sanctioned vessel? The U.S. Coast Guard has been pursuing it for days. The crew has apparently painted a Russian flag to claim Russian protection. Is this a small sign that there's a risk of broadening this conflict beyond Venezuela?
Is that for me, Ariel?
Yes, it is. Sorry.
Okay. Well, everything they do is an example of something that's a greater risk for the U.S. and for Venezuela, being in combat. We've had a lot of incidents in our history, going back to the Gulf of Tonkin incident in Vietnam, going back to other Central American countries where we have tried to engineer regime change, that they're looking for an excuse to actually use military force. This, by the way, it's a vessel without a flag in international waters. It's being approached by the Coast Guard. This is the most legitimate thing that the Trump administration has done. Everything else is illegitimate.
There has been broad consensus on that point, that trying to sanction these vessels to apprehend them has been the best and most effective way to put pressure on the Maduro regime. Adam, let's turn to Ukraine now. You have an extensive, expansive look in the Times detailing how the U.S. partnership with Kyiv has seemed to deteriorate over the past year. It's based on, I believe, 300 interviews. What are your key takeaways?
Well, I mean, the President Trump came in and he wanted to change it, and he certainly has changed it. There was a group of people in the administration, sort of led by allies of Vance, who, realized that we had a shortage of shells that they wanted to devote to countering China. And so they started to strip away, support to Ukraine gradually, while Trump, had the option of imposing sanctions to try to put some pressure on Putin, but he was reluctant to do so. And as this was sort of going on, Ukraine's position is weakening in the East. And really, a group of people at the CIA and in the military decide that they need to do something. And they come up with a drone campaign that they're enabling to help the Ukrainians go after oil refineries deep inside Russia and against oil tankers that the Russians are using to dodge sanctions. And basically, that's what's sort of the only pressure or major pressure that was being put on the Russians.
I think we are starting to see the nexus of all of these things play out. Adam, President Trump says land disputes are one of the, quote, thorny issues still on the table with these peace negotiations. How has Trump's approach to these talks evolved from your reporting over the past year?
I think, at the very beginning, Trump was of the mind during the campaign. He talked about it all the time. He thought this was going to be super easy, that he would basically have a phone call with Putin and somehow this thing would be settled. And he completely underestimated Putin's commitment to his maximalist demands. And he overestimated the influence that he had over Putin. And I think, Trump has been very frustrated by this, and you see it occasionally with his posts on Truth Social. And he would talk to his advisors privately about imposing sanctions on the banking sector or the oil sector in Russia. But then he wouldn't do it for months and months. He wouldn't do it because he was afraid that if he pulled the trigger on that, Putin would walk away because he just really wants this deal. So you have this tremendous ambition from Trump and in particular and some of his advisors, but then you just have like chaos through the system. And so a combination of all that ambition, but really not a process to make it happen is what this story really describes.
And we saw a little bit of that chaos unfolding, David, as Russia claimed that Ukraine targeted Putin's residence. Zelensky says that's fake news. The U.S. ambassador to NATO says it is unclear whether that actually happened or not. Is this just a red herring to derail the peace talks?
We don't know, but I think, and Adam knows more about this than I do, but I would think U.S. intelligence agencies would be able to figure out if this happened. The claim is that 91 drones crossed into Russian airspace and went to this residence, one of several residences of Vladimir Putin. They were all shot down, the Russians claim. So there should be some kind of way to track this and see. So I would expect someone in the Trump administration to come forward and give an answer, yes or no, did this happen? And if they don't, then it could be part of this broader dynamic that Adam talked about so eloquently in terms of the administration not wanting to upset Putin, not wanting him to walk away from talks. So it's still a mystery as far as I know.
It is definitely a delicate moment. Rick, even if the truth is somewhere here in the middle about that alleged attack on Putin's residence, what does this say about Moscow's position at the moment and its negotiating power?
Well, Aaron, what we learned over the last year is that truth is not usually in the middle somewhere, that the Russians, even when I was in the State Department, make up things out of whole cloth. It's not even a shred of reality to it. What was so disturbing about it was the fact that Donald Trump took Vladimir Putin's word for it over that of his own intelligence agency, over that of our allies, that he immediately assumed that what Putin was telling him was the truth. And presumably what his intelligence agency was telling him was something that was false. And we have seen that since Trump's first term, since his first summit with Putin. You mentioned the talks with Zelensky the other day. Yes, he had talks with Zelensky the other day. But of course, he had a phone call with Putin right before, and he had a phone call with Putin right afterwards. So this continues to be a mystery inside of an enigma, and you all know that saying.
Inside of a riddle, and however it goes. Jake, Zelensky also told reporters that he and Trump are discussing an option that potentially could see the deployment of U.S. troops inside of Ukraine. That would perk a lot of ears up. What is the White House saying about security guarantees that Zelensky wants to see here?
Yeah, Ariel, I mean, you've got kind of two different things that you have to listen to here. One, it's what Ukrainian President Zelensky is saying Trump said, and then you have what Trump and the White House are confirming that they actually said. Zelensky has said that the United States has promised at least a 15-year security guarantee. Ukraine has said they wanted even more than that. President Trump and the White House have not confirmed that number. And this is something, this type of kind of back and forth is something we've seen when it comes to Putin, Zelensky, and the conversations they have with the president really for the past 11 months, where out of a conversation we glean some things from some of these foreign leaders, but the White House and the president don't necessarily agree that that was actually what was discussed. It is worth noting that when the president has talked about it in recent days about the securities guarantees, he has said that he expects European countries to, quote, take over a big part of that effort with the U.S. backing. So not necessarily passing the buck off to European countries entirely, but also saying that it will not be an entirely United States responsibility.